Okay, so let's get ourselves comfortable in our seats. You're welcome to keep the camera on. I think that enhances the sense of connection in the group, but also if you want to turn it off, that's totally fine and acceptable.
Let me just restart because I just got this box in the middle that says waiting, or is that normal?
No, it's not normal.
Okay, let me try to restart this.
Okay, go for it.
Sorry.
Hey, Mónica.
Hola.
Hola.
¿Me escuchas? ¿Todo bien?
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Okay. It's tricky. How about now? Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, that's wonderful. Okay, so we have a very intimate group today. I think it's really nice to go into this subject with a small group so that we can dive into it in a deeper way. I would like to give 1 more minute to see if the others are joining. So let's start with the meditation. You can get comfortable in your seat. If possible, turn your microphone off so that there's no interference patterns. Thank you so much. And we can close our eyes gently. And we're going to do pranayama to begin with and to center ourselves for the material that we are about to go into. And Samavriti pranayama is a really useful pranayama to balance our brain waves, and it's super simple to do. Samavriti means equal length, which means that we're going to be inhaling for the same amount of time that we are exhaling. And this allows this sense of balance slowly as we begin to do it. And so you can begin by exhaling fully all of the oxygen that is in your body. And when you're ready, you can begin to take an inhale. Inhaling fully, allowing your lungs to receive this fresh oxygen. And hold in that breath. And when you're ready, you can begin to exhale gently, softly. So we will begin by inhaling for 1, 2, 3. And you're going to hold that inhalation in for 1, 2, 3. Exhaling softly for 1, 2, 3. And you're going to stay without breath for 1, 2, 3. Inhaling for 1, 2, 3. Holding that breath in for 1, 2, 3. Exhaling gently for 1, 2, 3. And holding yourself without breath for 1, 2, 3. And see if it's possible for you to guide yourself a few more breaths in Samavriti. And then letting go of the need to control or manipulate the breath, just allowing yourself to breathe as you are, allowing the rhythm to become natural again. With each inhalation, you are going to be taking in all of your expectations, let's say, of this workshop. And with the exhalation, relaxing, releasing, letting go. Okay, and when you're ready, you can open your eyes. And we can say hello to one another. I think this is about as many as we'll get for today. So namaste. Welcome all of you to this workshop, the structuring layers of the self. It's a really complex name. I realized there's so many, there's such few of us this time around. And I think this is wonderful because, as I was saying earlier, it's an opportunity to go deeper into the layers that we will be discovering. And so I want to start this morning with a reading from Buddhist teacher and grief counselor Frank Ostesaki. I'm going to share the screen with you. Here we go. Can everybody see it? Okay. So he says, to be whole, we need to include, accept, and connect all parts of ourselves. We need acceptance of our conflicting qualities and the seeming incongruity of our inner and outer worlds. Wholeness does not mean perfection. It means no part left out. And I find this so powerful. I actually find it like a poem that brings a lot of it soothes my heart when I read it. And it's something that doesn't need to be conceptualized. I think it's more of like opening up experience to all of the parts that we have internally. And each part has a different interest, and we'll get to that along the workshop. But I want you to take a moment here to reflect on how this quote applies to your life right now. Maybe you can read the quote on your own. And just take a moment to see if there's, for any reason, a pushing away of one part that feels maybe uncomfortable, or a part that we feel that doesn't belong, that's not correct, that is somehow deficient, that is somehow not good. Getting pretty ticky here. Okay. So I want to introduce this meditation technique. It's a Buddhist meditation technique that's synchronized with Western psychology. It's actually from Tara Brach. She's one of my most influential teachers at the moment, and the technique is called RAIN. And RAIN is an acronym that stands for recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. And so with this quote that I was reading from Franco Stafecki, we can practice RAIN, and that will be like the beginning of this workshop as to see, okay, where is self-sabotage really going on? And we'll get into it later. But as for this moment, I want that to be like the ground we're working on. Does that make sense? Because we can go into a lot of theory and I can give you a lot of tools and so on and so forth, but it really does come down to how present can you be with yourself in loving awareness. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's try this out. You can close your eyes and begin recognizing what arises in your being when we talk about conflicting qualities and incongruities within ourselves. Maybe you can recognize there's a force of you that is pulling you in one direction, and then there's this other force of you that has a completely different plan. See what comes up when you begin to observe internally. Maybe there's a part that somehow is neglected, a part of our being that we haven't really turned towards. Maybe there's this part of ourselves that has been constantly asking for our attention, and we address it by not having time, or it's too unbearable to look at right now. I just recognizing all the parts. And see if there is one specific aspect of your being that is calling your attention. It doesn't have to be one specific, but if you see there's this part of the self that is calling in for your attention, we can move into the A, which is to allow. Because this is what the quote is inviting us to do, to include, accept, and connect all parts of ourselves, to accept that there's conflicting qualities, seeming incongruities of our inner and outer worlds. And there's this softening that happens when we accept. It can be like a relief. Or perhaps there's contraction and we can accept that there's contraction. Or we can also accept that there's not acceptance. You can take it as any level as you want with the acceptance. Allowing whatever arises to be there. And the moment that we allow is when we can move to the I, the investigation part. We can investigate, okay, what happened? And we don't have to go into a historical timeline right now. We will do that later. So for this moment is investigate what is happening now. I think the I could also stand for including. It's like welcoming these aspects of our being, incorporating, integrating. Because when we talk about wholeness, there's this image, or at least for me, and many on the spiritual path, that wholeness is somehow linked to perfection. But in trying to achieve perfection, there is a neglect of that which hasn't been integrated. And I think doing this exercise in the beginning can allow us to tune deeper into what is called in IFS, in internal family systems, the subtle self. So the most genuine aspect of ourself. And that is when we can begin to nurture. The N stands for nurturing, to nourish, to bring love to those aspects of our being. And see how this quality of nurturing re-enlivens the self, that genuine aspect of our being. And see if this gives a sense of wholeness. Perhaps there's a shift on when we started the workshop and this moment right now. Almost like an anchoring into presence. And from this space, allowing this workshop to be an opportunity to connect deeper with these aspects of the self. Maybe some that already came up, others that may have not yet revealed themselves. But you'll see why it's so important to address this information from this state of being and not from a mental space. You're meeting these concepts with an open heart, because that is the only way that they can have an impact on our being. They can actually transform, because we can know a lot. But it's when we drop into our somatic experience, into our being, that things can actually begin to shift. And so when you're ready, you can open your eyes and say hello again. And we have Tanya coming in. So everybody's joining after one meditation. It's funny. Hi, Tanya. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
You're welcome. No, it's nice to have you here. We just finished a meditation that you can do later when we've done when I send you the recording. But I do want to catch you up with a quote that we were exploring together. It's from Frank Ostesaki. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a Buddhist teacher and a grief counselor. And he's speaking about wholeness. And he says, to be whole, we need to include, accept, and connect all parts of ourselves. We need acceptance of our conflicting qualities and the seeming incongruity of our inner and outer worlds. Wholeness does not mean perfection. It means no part left out. And so we begin by recognizing and including all of ourselves, or at least what we have access to, when we decide to not turn away, to not neglect. Because it is the turning away from ourselves that, or turning away from discomfort, or turning away from what feels contracted. Does that make sense? that creates a sense of disharmony within our being. And each of us has a natural, I don't know how natural it is, but it has a conditioned tendency for self-aversion, for self-neglect, because we have this idea of ourselves that we think we need to be consistent with. And
Sorry, what was just the last thing you said? We have an idea of our.
oh, sorry.
Just the last sentence you said that we have an idea of ourselves that what? Sorry.
So we have an idea of ourselves that is continuous. Like for instance, I am Prema, I'm a meditation teacher, I studied in an ashram, therefore I should always wear white, I should always be graceful, I should always speak with peace, I am not allowed to get angry, I am not allowed to have sexual desire, I'm not allowed to, you know, like we build an idea of who we are, like an identity, right? And it can be like, I'm a psychologist, therefore I have no problems, or I am a vegan and therefore I don't crave cheese, you know, like whatever. It can go from like really, really subtle things like I was a nun and therefore I see God in everything, to like more like what we would say superficial identities. But the mind is accustomed to one idea of who we are. And yet there are so many layers to who we are that if we are stuck with that idea, we have a tendency for self-aversion and we reject parts of our being. Does that make sense? Okay. And so in opening ourselves to the fullness of who we are, we begin to welcome all of these parts. And by welcoming all these parts, we begin to find freedom. And it's really tricky here because this freedom is a very inherent aspect of our being. So with the example that I was using before, and in these workshops, I use myself as an example because that's the most, like the closest case I have, but you'll have to use yourself as an example also. Like I'm putting myself on the table, like really vulnerably, so that all of us can put ourselves on the table. It's not like a narcissistic speech, right? It's so that you feel welcome to do the same with yourself. So for instance, finding freedom, talking about sexual desire, like, does that mean that then I get to sleep with everybody? Is that really the way that I would find freedom? That's where wisdom comes along. So it's really tender. It's very, it's very subtle, the ways that we will find freedom, because it doesn't mean bypassing, right? So the more that we begin to look inside, the more we realize how fragmented we actually are. So we have a part of ourselves that wants to go in this direction, as I was saying before, and then there's this other part of ourselves that is completely decided that it's going to go in this direction. And then there's this other part that knows it's going in that direction. And it seems that these parts are not in communication with each other. So I wake up with this wonderful idea of what I'm going to do starting today, the 10 next years from now. It's this amazing idea. And I have like all of the structure and all of the maps of how am I going to do this. And then the next morning I wake up and I don't find the inspiration to do that. Or I'm very convinced that I want to live a very healthy lifestyle. And yet I find myself having a binge episode. And all of these things that are very, very normal in human behavior that we tend to call self-sabotage. But this fragmentation of our beings is usually, because what I'm trying to do is depathologize. I'm trying to take away the stigma of like, that this is somehow sick, because all of us have this. It's natural. The ego is fragmented by nature. And so it's usually fragmented because of misunderstandings. It's usually fragmented because of the cultural conditioning that we have. And the way that we look at reality through filters since when we are very young. In fact, prior to that, and that we'll get to that with the structuring layers of the self. But these filters begin to create this sense of separation, because it's all in our perception, right? It's the way that we see life. And so these filters begin to create a sense of separation between myself, the other, myself, the world, myself from God, myself from love, myself from spirit. Does that make sense? The sense of separation is what begins to create the fragmentation. And what I have realized over the last 7 years is that self-sabotage is usually this really innocent call for attention. Does that make sense? Because when we look at the material from this workshop, and we'll get into maybe what seems like a lot of dense stuff, it is important to see it from the lens of self-compassion. And this is where Advaita is so useful. Like Advaita Vedanta teaches us to not necessarily bypass what is going on, but rather see what is going on from a sense of a container. So what we were doing before with rain, accessing this subtle self of our being, this genuine aspect of our being that can then see everything that is happening. And it feels much more manageable, because it can be very overwhelming when we are starting to dive into self-understanding. And especially when we sit in meditation, and especially when we sit in meditation consistently, and especially when we sit in meditation after many years of practicing meditation, and it can become very overwhelming to see that the mind doesn't stop. And it can be very overwhelming to see that there's all of these conflicting aspects within ourselves. But that is exactly it. That is the medicine, sitting with all that is inside and all of the chaos, or what may seem like chaos, or like the different directions that our being is pulling. That is the medicine, because that's where the process of integration begins. When we are coming back home, this is what heals this sense of fragmentation. But it makes a lot of sense that we shy away from it. And I'm like, I know because I'm there every day. Our limbic system is accustomed to always see what's bad. It's like we're always on this like automatic fight flight mode, and we're always seeing like what we call like in neurobiology the black dot. And I want to share with you this really funny, well, I thought it was really funny, cartoon. I actually saw this in another version. I couldn't find it, but there's like a dog in the therapy office, and he's complaining, and he's saying like, why is it always good dog this, good dog that, and why is it never like great dog? Nobody calls me a great dog. And see if there is something of this nature within you, like always seeing what is bad and never seeing what is actually happening. And so when we recognize the beliefs and the fears that sustain this trance of unworthiness, oh, and I forgot to explain, okay, so this sense of separation that I was speaking about creates what Tara Brach calls the trance of unworthiness, which is a trance because it's not reality, right? It's almost like this veil from which we are seeing the world. And it creates a sense of separation, which makes us feel deficient, somehow lacking, somehow unworthy. So when we begin to recognize the beliefs and the fears that sustain this trance of unworthiness, we can begin to find freedom. And it's very useful when we can make space to pause and consider which are the parts of ourselves that we are habitually, because it's not something that comes up one day. It's things that we've been pushing away for every day of our lives. And I want us to do an experiment with this. So we have this tendency to run away from the present moment because of the fear that comes up when we feel separated. And so I want us to do an experiment. You can close your eyes for a moment, and we can take a deep breath through the nose, exhaling softly, relaxing, releasing, letting go. Okay. Do you see how quickly the mind tends to leave the body? It's often like we're on this trance like it's our automatic response. There's this natural tendency to create this disconnection. That's the trance of unworthiness. I don't know if you were able to follow along in the meditation or you caught yourself somewhere up in the stars, but it's really quickly, automatic response, the mind leaves, right? And so I want this workshop to be like it's a very short workshop, but I want it to be, if anything, I want it to be a way for you to train your awareness to not leave, so that you don't have to run away from yourself, but rather you can learn to cultivate a loving presence that holds all the structuring layers of the self that can feel very overwhelming. And that's why Advaita is so important. And that is where the slide I was sharing with you makes sense. And I'll read it again. Recognizing the beliefs and fears that sustain the trance of unworthiness is the beginning of freedom. It is very useful when we can make space to pause and consider the parts of the parts of ourselves that we usually habitually reject and push away. So I want us to take a look at some preliminary beliefs before we get into the actual structures. And I'm going to be asking you some questions that are posed in the book Radical Acceptance. I highly recommend this book. It will be on the resource library. The name. One day we can have the book. And you don't have to write down these the answers to these questions. You don't have to write down the questions. You'll get all these questions later with all the material. I actually want you to not think about these questions if possible. I want you to experience these questions on a somatic level. So rather than saying, okay, yeah, this makes sense, I want you to feel how it feels when I ask one of these questions. And some questions will resonate more than others. And I want you to allow yourself to experience whatever comes up, because no answer is going to be good or bad or right or wrong. The idea is for you to cultivate this sense of awareness of what is truly going on inside. And something that I have found in the last year is that there is this very, very ardent need for self-compassion. We tend to have a lot of compassion for the world, but it is when it comes to ourselves, it's like the last one on the list. And that can sound very cliche, but it's actually true. And one of the most powerful techniques that I have found is super simple. It's placing your left hand, your left palm on your heart. And you can see if this resonates for you. For me, it's like this immediate sense of compassion, a warm embrace to myself. And you can feel if it resonates. If it doesn't, you can just leave your hands on your palms and we can close the eyes again and I will read the questions. And I invite you to truly experience them on the level of your being. Do I accept my body as it is? Do I blame myself when I get sick? Do I feel I am not attractive enough? Am I dissatisfied with how my hair looks? Am I embarrassed about how my face and body are aging? Do I judge myself for being too thin, too heavy, underweight, not physically fit? Do I accept my mind as it is? Do I judge myself for not being intelligent enough, humorous enough, interesting enough? Am I critical of myself for having obsessive thoughts, for having repetitive thoughts? Do I blame myself for having a boring mind? Am I ashamed of myself for having bad thoughts, thoughts that are mean, judgmental, lustful? Do I consider myself a bad meditator because my mind is so busy? Do I accept my emotions and moods as they are? Is it okay for me to cry? Is it okay for me to feel insecure? Is it okay for me to feel vulnerable? Do I condemn myself for getting depressed, feeling down? Am I ashamed for feeling jealous? Am I critical of myself for being impatient, irritable, intolerant? Do I feel my anger or anxiety is a sign that I am not progressing on the spiritual path? Do I feel I'm a bad person because of the ways that I behave when nobody's watching? Am I ashamed of my outbursts of anger? Do I feel disgusted with myself when I eat compulsively? If I smoke or I drink? Do I feel that because I am selfish and not often put others first, I am not spiritually evolved? Do I feel as if I am always falling short in how I relate to my family and friends? Do I feel something is wrong with me because I am not capable of intimacy? Am I down on myself for not accomplishing enough, for not standing out, for not being special in my work? Okay, so it's this recognition that begins the path of freedom. And you can open your eyes when you're ready. I want to share with you this epiphany that I had, and some of you may already be quite familiar with it, but for me it was like a total jackpot. There's this fascinating thing that our mind does, that we begin by feeling somehow small or weak or deficient or not good enough. And this is like the outcast part of ourselves. And there's many parts of ourselves that feel that, like somehow we're not allowed to shine, or somehow we should stay small, or there was something that wasn't good enough ever. All of these, the answers to all of these questions. What is fascinating to me is that immediately when there's this sense of weakness, we create this like superior stance to protect that weak part. And so for many of us, the weak part may be really easy to access. But for some of us, we may discover that there's actually a protector part of this little entity. So we somehow, it's like what in psychology we would call inferiority and superiority complexes. Like neither of them are true, but there's somehow like this sense that we need to protect the part of us that feels deficient by being overachievers, over accomplishers, like always wanting to shine, always wanting to be the most. Does that make sense? Like there's this need to compensate, right? And so if we feel deficient in some way, we will try to overachieve in another way to not feel the vulnerability of this part. Does this make sense to everybody? Okay. So when we're talking about being present to these parts, it doesn't mean that we ignore that this is not going on, or that meditation or spirituality means that this no longer happens. And I have this in the slide I will share with you.
Rema, that
Yes?
could be like if someone have like a lack of a spirituality, that they push too much energy, I don't know, like working too much or like in other things to overcompensate that lack.
Can you repeat the question?
Like when you said like that needed to compensate, that could be like similar when someone have like a lack of a spirituality, that they need to overachieve or they look to fill that emptiness, like I don't know, working too much or like getting a degree or like trying to overachieve in other, I mean like in doing a lot of sports, but they still have like a lot of lack of spirituality.
Yeah, for certain.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Like I always describe it as this puzzle that we have one piece that is God, and we can call God self, Buddha mind, heart mind, Christ consciousness. It doesn't matter what name we call it. It's where we come from. It's the source. It's undescribable. We have no words for it, but it's love. It's our spirit. And we're trying to put together this puzzle of our lives. And we can try to put parts to fit that one piece of the puzzle. Like we can try to put a degree, or we can try to put a training, or we can try to put boyfriends, shopping, drugs, whatever we want to put into it. But it's only that which will satiate the need. But it's Danny wrote here a recommendation. Yeah, The Conscious Femininity is a great book. Thank you, Danny. But what is so interesting is that also what is spirituality, and it's not a form, right? It's not necessarily one practice. And it is like, I tend to like to think about spirituality as this underlying thread behind everything of our lives. So it doesn't matter what we do or what we get engaged with, that is always there. Because I really liked your question, Maria, because I'm feeling right now like there's this lack with my education because of some conditioning of upbringing and my mother in university, and that created a sense of lack in me. So even though right now some people may think that I'm prepared, I'm constantly needing to learn something new, not finished with one training, already starting the next. I have currently going 3 trainings. It's like, it's great that one wants to keep learning, but we really need to fine tune into what is our intention for seeking, because obviously it's great. I mean, it's great that we want to grow and learn and develop and so forth, but the path of self-development can be quite self-deprecating, actually. Like when we look at these terms, right? We need to be really careful with our intention, because if it's coming to fill up our lack, it's never going to fill up our lack. Did I share the screen?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question. No la compartí, ¿verdad? Okay. So here's where the gist with spirituality gets super juicy and interesting, because how do we think about spirituality? Is it a particular dogma or religion? And I explained in last workshop that religion, like somebody had a lot of aversion to the word religion, and when we trace it back etymologically, religion comes from the Latin word religare, which means to reunite. And so there's not a dogma there. It's like, okay, we're reuniting something that has not been, something that has been separated, right? And it's usually our tiny self with the heart mind, or with the Buddha nature, or with our real self. There is this concept called the open ground of being. The ground of being, actually. Has anybody heard of this? Okay. This is the word or the concept that Paul Tillich, he's a German philosopher and a Christian mystic. This is the way that he addressed God, the ground of being. I love this, because every time we feel groundless, or like there's this rug that has been swept off our feet, where do we land? And what's so interesting is that he's a Christian mystic, and it's addressing God as the ground of being. When you begin to look at Dzogchen, which is the Buddhist, one of the Buddhist traditions, the primordial state, or how they address God, although they would call it no God or no self, but how they talk about supreme reality is ground, the ground also. I love comparative religion. And so I want us to look at meditation as this non-act, because it's not something that we do, it's something that we are. So this non-act of unblending ourselves from the layers. Meditation is the capacity to abide as the ground from which all appears and disappears. Does this make sense? It's a little bit complex. Más o menos. Okay, so I think this slide would be really helpful. I'll go over the slide and I'll weave in the ideas. So lately I've been thinking a lot about distilling. Distilling it's this thinning through the layers to get to the essence of something. The essence of ourselves in this case. And so I want us to approach meditation, or to try to approach meditation, as this piercing through the layers to get to the ground. So when we were doing RAIN, and we were recognizing and allowing and inviting, investigating and nurturing, all of that was happening from a very genuine standpoint of the self, right? That could be described as the ground. It's not necessarily the ground as God, but it is the ground of a truer self. Does that make sense now? A little bit more? Más o menos. Okay, another way of putting it is in Christianity, we have the via negativa, which is going to a negation, meaning recognizing what is not true. Because we can't really say what is true. I mean, we can't, as everybody says, like, you can't really know the name of God, or once you see the face of God, you cannot live. You know, like the truth cannot really be stated. Once you state it, it's like gone, right? And so the via negativa in Christianity, or the act of unblending, or the act of distilling, is when we turn inward and we say, okay, this is not really it, this is not really it, this is not really it. And this is what in Vedanta is called neti neti. It's like is when we take this standpoint of saying, not this, it's not that, it's not this, it's not that. It's like we have this capacity to pierce through what seems what it is, but it's not. Does that make sense? It's kind of complex. But this is,
Sorry, me again. It could be like when something doesn't give you like a good vibe, that you feel like that is not like resonate with you, or
yeah.
okay.
And learning to do that with our own self. Because we have all these traps of identification, right? Like what I was saying before about me, like, no, but this is not it. Like, okay, all of these are roles. And it's really good to have roles because we need roles in society. And we'll get to that when we talk about archetypes. But the question is, who am I truly? Like, yes, I can say, I'm Prema, I'm a meditation teacher, I'm taking this, I'm taking that, I do this work with people, but who am I really? That's a role, right? And before, when this question was posed, like, who am I really? We used to have like that Descartes, I think, therefore I am, you know. But the more we think, the less we actually know who we are. The more we think, the less we can actually be. Because everything the mind creates forms an identity. This is perhaps where the distilling will make more sense. Everything the mind thinks, and it thinks because it received it from another, it received it from the world, it received it primarily from our mother, but then our father, and then all of our family system, our friends, we'll see it on the structures. Everything the mind thinks becomes an identity. It absorbs from the other what we should do or be. And we have one primary decision. Are we in agreement or are we not in agreement? But it's structured under those paradigms. And so we can take on many roles, but does that really define who we are? And so I want to share with you, talking about the ground, or talking about this state of awareness, talking about this sense of presence of our open heart. I want to read to you a quote from Nisargadatta Maharaj that I find very poetical, and it takes me there, and it may bring a little bit more clarity to you. Does the river get thirsty anytime? Does it stop somewhere? The river does not know how, where, and why it flows. This indescribable state is something similar, in which there is neither knowingness nor non-knowingness. When something is needed, it comes naturally, or goes away when not required. We are not that which comes, nor that which goes away. What exists is only the knowingness of what comes or goes. That has never come from anywhere and will never go anywhere. Whatever appears to have come or gone is only an illusion, a semblance, and the semblance is only momentary. And this is the ground from which Advaita is built. This is the process of what Ramana Maharshi is, an Indian sage who developed a lot of the teachings of non-duality. This is what is referred to the ground of being. It's like the river doesn't know where it's going. The same with the soul, the same with the heart, right? It's this undescribable state of not knowing and yet recognizing what appears and what disappears, right? So maybe that can clarify a little bit when we're describing meditation is allowing ourselves to open awareness to such an extent that we can open-heartedly meet life where it is, whatever is coming, whatever is going, no matter the conditions, and saying that, okay, this is not really who I am, this is not who I am, so who am I? And that's the premise of Advaita, of self-inquiry, asking the question, who am I? And not to repeat myself too much, but that's where distilling becomes so important. Like the work of alchemy is to see, okay, wow, there's this part of me that is there really because of a misunderstanding, very innocent misunderstanding about reality that came from the way that maybe a teacher spoke to me, or the way that a mentor let me down, or the way that some of my classmates looked at me, or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's an introjection about oneself that creates a belief about who we are. But that's not it, right? So who am I? That's the process of distilling. And we're going to get a little bit woo-woo with this quote from the Song of the Avadut, which is an ancient text, really, really beautiful. It's one of the most poetical ones I've read on Advaita. The one God who shines within everything, who is formless like the cloudless sky, is the purest, stainless self of all. Without any doubt, that is who I am. This is from Sri Dastrayeva, of the Song of the Avadut. And so it sounds woo-woo because it's quite expanded, but this is actually what we can distill to when we are able to pierce through the layers. And so there's two principles going on. And I remember, Danny, when I left the ashram, like that week we did a meditation at my house, and I explained to you this principle of like expansion and contraction. Do you remember that meditation? It's like when we're going inward, there's these two forces, one that is expanding and one that is contracting, or one that is like piercing through. And so meditation is the same, like we're recognizing we're wholeness, we're a part of everything. And it's so beautiful, like even if we think about like the air we breathe, like the oxygen I'm breathing now is the same oxygen you are breathing now. Like everything is intrinsically connected, and we're all one part. It's the same air that the birds are flying on, right? Everything is a part of this beautiful, chaotic reality. And the more that we can tune into that cosmic nature in a way, the more we can pierce through, okay, so who am I really? But what happens is that we come from this state of expansion that, again, we can call, here are some of my favorite terms, you may have your own. We come from pure awareness, or Gyote Bindu, which means point of light in Hindu. The Atman, the real self, Christ consciousness, the Buddha mind, Bodhicitta, Satchitananda, however you want to call this larger piece of our being. And the more we receive influence from the world, which we all do, the more we forget, which is Maria's question. And then we begin to look in other aspects of life, this part of our being that is indispensable. And so when we forget, let's say, let me think how I can put this in more clear terms based on your questions. So when we come into this world, what happens prior to that is a complete mystery. A lot of people have written books on near-death experiences. A lot of people have done work on like planes beyond, but we don't know. We don't know what happens before we come to the world, but what we do know is that it is a mystery. And this mystery is very expansive. And so when we come to this world, everything is like the world of forms. It's very like shapy. It's no longer free, right? And so we receive so many stimulus from the world that we have to form a stimulus barrier when we're little. And this stimulus barrier is, it's almost like the bouncer in a party that decides like who can come in and who can't go, like who can come in, who can't go in. And it is the way that we process reality. And Melanie Klein, she was a wonderful psychoanalytic theorist. She was the first woman after Anna Freud to become a psychoanalyst. And she did a lot of her work with children. So this is where I'm getting this information, because she discovered that the stimulus that we were receiving as children were quite overwhelming. And so there needed to be a way to cope with it so that we basically didn't go crazy, because the smells are overwhelming. The people, like there's so many people we don't know. There's so many smells we don't know, sounds we don't know. Things may feel traumatic, even though they're not when we're adults, or some things may be quite traumatic. Irregardless of the degree, we need to form some sort of structure in order to cope with life. Yeah, does that make sense? And she described this as a semi-permeable membrane, which is like, do you remember in biology, the cell has this capacity to like welcome some lipids, but not others? It's like the function of the bouncer, right? Like, okay, I can handle this. So this information I will allow myself to know. This seems a little bit too overwhelming. I'm going to push this out, you know? Maybe the way somebody talked to me was really mean or somehow twisted, or maybe the way that somebody touched me had second intentions, or maybe the way that I saw my parents interacting was quite overwhelming. And so those things feel too much for our sense of self to handle. And so we push those things away. The thing is, when we push those things away, we begin to create a division. It's what in Sanskrit, it's called satarivu, which is a split mind. We create this sense, another sense of separation between what we can know and what we can't know. So the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, basically. And so it's interesting to look at the unconscious, because I just finished this book by Eric Fromm called Psychoanalysis and Buddhism. It's great if you want to read it or take a look at it. He talks about how they interweave, and it's really beautiful, because the unconscious is this storage place of the things that felt overwhelming. And they get stored in our mind as an encrypted code that gets frozen in time. And those words may seem weird, but the point of it is that we cannot store things as they are, because they are overwhelming, right? If we store it as they are, they would be in the conscious mind. They would be stored as memories. In the unconscious, we store things in a distorted way, in the way that we interpreted it. That's why they are called fantasies, because it's not really in congruency with reality. And so the work of working with the unconscious, or the whole basis of psychoanalysis, is to, okay, let's look at what got trapped there in time, see how it is influencing life now, and see if there is a way to decode this code. It's usually stored in ourselves in a code, and a code that may be like a symbol or a twisted memory, and it comes up in our triggers. Usually we get triggered because of unconscious things. And it can be very, very simple. Like, I'm going to share with you an example of something that felt traumatic to me, which is actually not, but it's valid, and maybe you can relate to it, to your childhood. So when I was younger and my mother was pregnant with my brother, we were playing in my room. It was this total sense of like playfulness and togetherness, and I had my mother all to myself, and it was this wonderful, loving experience. And the phone rings in the house, so my mom gets up to pick up the phone. And when she goes to pick up the phone and she's not coming back, I have this sense of total abandonment. Later in life, like every time a phone rings, I get anxiety. And I get anxiety because I feel like I'm going to be abandoned because somebody else is going to go pick up the phone. But does that really mean that I'm being abandoned? It's based on a pattern of childhood that's quite innocent. It was a misunderstanding, right? But then I build a fantasy around it, and then I associate that with her being pregnant with my little brother and preferring my little brother over me and yada yada, and like whatever, my life continues. So like I want to use really simple examples because this can get quite grotesque. Like it's not the same to explore the unconscious as if like a child is growing up in Baghdad and there's an explosion, right? Like that can create a real sense of trauma. Or if our mother is a prostitute and that's the way that she's paying for the bills, and we realize that she's always taking a different man and abuses her every night, like that can create a really strong sense of like trauma, which then we need to decode, right? What I'm trying to say is that it doesn't matter the degree. It's the same for every human being. It doesn't matter what happened. And so these traumatic memories from childhood, they get frozen in time and they create a structure to how we protect ourselves. And so when we begin to repress, not only do we repress these things that may seem overwhelming, but we also repress our infinite nature, because people obviously are not addressing us as like, hello Buddha nature, how did you wake up today? Are you ready to like explore the universe? Like you're this little boy or this little girl and you have to go to school, right? And so the magic of translating what is inside of us, of the magic of translating, I mean like arriving to a trigger, like for instance, something as simple as I get anxious when a phone rings, or I used to get anxious when a phone rings, and exploring that, piercing through the layers and recognizing, okay, what triggered this, and translating that into the present moment gives us a sense of meaning. And that meaning usually gives us the sense of okayness, you know, like, okay, I can have compassion towards this situation. I'm now in a witnessing position because I'm no longer like entangled in it or identified in it. And then I'm no longer a victim of the situation. And this is what shifts us from being in autopilot, like constantly being triggered by situations, to being in a state of sovereignty, like, okay, I understand this is what's going on. And doing that moment by moment. And the thing is, in Buddhism, there's this wonderful concept called the cycle of emerging conditions. And how it works is that it's literally a cycle of emerging conditions. So it does not stop presenting conditions that bring pleasure or conditions that bring pain. Conditions that bring gain, and because they bring gain, they bring loss. Conditions that bring fame, and because they bring fame, they bring disgrace. It's always bringing pairs of opposites, like what I was describing with us feeling weak and then us trying to compensate in some kind of way. The same does life. This is actually called the 8 worldly dharmas in Buddhism. Like pleasure will always come with pain, and vice versa. They're not interchangeable. They're always arising at the same time, whether we recognize it or not. And so when we become aware that there's this cycle of conditions coming and going, pleasure and pain, okay, something feels pleasurable, we want to get attached to it. We want it to last forever. right? Something feels discomforting or something doesn't feel good, something is evoking suffering, we want to immediately run away from it. And that is the wheel of samsara. That's like what keeps us on the loop always, rather than like opening ourselves and meeting life with all that it brings. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so are you ready? We're going to dive into the structuring layers of the self, finally. So I want to make like this disclaimer. I try to make this as like logical and comprehensive as possible. But I want us to be aware that we're talking about the psyche, which is extremely complex. And so even though this drawing sort of like depicts the structures in order, or like it gives this sense of like, okay, these things are neatly organized, it's all interwoven. And so what I'm trying to do is like distill, again, like trying to somehow make it comprehensive for us to even begin to approach it. So all this to say that even though we will try to go veil by veil or structure by structure or energy by energy, they're all happening at the same time, okay? So the first layer that structures our being is the sensor. And the sensor is what I was addressing before as the stimulus barrier. But I really like the name sensor because it is this agency, literally, in our minds that decides what can come in and what can't, that decides what can we tolerate, really, and what we can't tolerate. Actually, affect tolerance is like crucial for spiritual development. It's when we can grow our capacity to contain the things that feel unbearable. And self-sabotage is when we don't allow ourselves to do that, because then we're shying away from the experience of life, and that's part of it. The sensor is, for me, it's the most interesting layer of all, because it's what determines how we relate to the other layers, and it will become clearer towards the end when we see a graph. But I want you to remember that the sensor was formed when we were very, very, very young, okay? So some things that seemed overwhelming when we were 3, 4, 5 years old will no longer be overwhelming when we're 25, 30, 35, 40, 55, 60 years old. The thing is, if we don't look inside and do inner work, it will continue to feel overwhelming. We may have different coping mechanisms, you know, like we may not throw a tantrum, right? But we will somehow, in another way, throw a tantrum. We will find a way to not deal with it, right? Because it is frozen in time. The unconscious and the sensor are frozen in time. So what that means is that what was, I'll repeat it, when what was overwhelming when we were quite young will continue to be overwhelming as we grow up. It doesn't mean that we will deal with it the same, because a child will probably just go look for mom. But we, in our own ways, go and look for mom. Maybe we won't look for a physical mother, but we'll look for some sort of mothering agency, you know, overeating, over drinking, over partying, over sex, a lot of inappropriate sexual activity. Like, we will find ways to not deal with the pain that life is presenting. And so the sensor is always limiting our capacity to know what is truly going on, and therefore limiting our capacity to grow, learn, give more love, give more care. And so it's really important here to recognize that the sensor, it's not like this devil-like figure. It's our own protective mechanism, but it's also our greatest inhibitor. So it plays these two functions. Like I really love the standpoint of Melanie Klein when she addresses child psychology, because it is really important that we recognize that this is formed out of love. Like, we formed this in order to protect ourselves when we were little, because we thought we weren't able to deal with it. But as we grow older, you know, we can deal with it. And magical things happen when we begin to trust that we can actually deal with it. If you have any questions, feel free to pop in the chat or unmute yourself. The intrauterine subconscious is a layer that goes beneath the sensor. And the intrauterine subconscious is preverbal. What this means is that it's before language, it's prior to language. And it's based on energetics and on projections. The intrauterine subconscious, as the name says, it happens when we're in utero, when we're in the womb of our mother. And I want us to think about two things right now, or again, to feel. When we are in the womb of the mother, we're beginning to form, right? This is our home. And I want you to think for a minute of one day in the recent past that you've had a super, super overwhelming kind of day. A day that you got to achieve a lot of the things in your checklist that you wanted to achieve, but you also failed in all the possible ways you can imagine. You're exhausted and all you want to do is rest. And I like to think of the soul and development in this way. Like, you know, it doesn't matter where it comes from. We can talk about past lives, we can talk about heaven, we can talk about whatever sort of theory. But the point is that the soul is coming into this world from, I mean, it's huge to conceive a baby. Like, it's such a mystery. Like, it must be exhausting to come into the womb, you know? And the womb, as this place of development, it should be a neutral space. It should be a neutral space, both physical and energetical. What do I mean by this? Like, when the baby starts to form, it's forming in the environment of the mother. And this is where epigenetics plays a huge role. It's super interesting. Like, the habits that our mother had are going to have an influence in the way that we develop. And same with our father's sperm, but primarily the mother's womb. And so energetically, it gets very subtle, because think of for a moment that you were to conceive a child right now. Or if you have conceived a child, the mind can get quite worried. Like, how am I going to feed this child? How am I going to pay for school? How am I going to make sure that the child is always in a safe environment? The overwhelm of like raising a child in this society. It's only natural to have that response of like, oh my God, fear, right? It's the most natural response that a human being can have when it's going to bring a child into the world, aside from the conscious and obvious, like, oh my God, we're having a baby, this is so nice. Like, it's like this love affair with being pregnant. But also underlying energetically, there's obviously like worry and our own mother's self-doubt, our own mother's sense of deficiency, our own mother's inner work that hasn't been done. And all of that is creating a space in the womb. And so we come into the womb, it's not verbal, but we begin to apperceive these things, you know, the decisions that our parents have to make, the sacrifices our parents have to make in order to raise us, all of that imprints our being. Not in a guilty way, but we take it on as a guilt. Not that they wanted us to be guilty, but we take it on as our own. And also, it's interesting in the intrauterine, I usually like to incorporate all the medical system, because this is when we are most influenced by like probing of tests, trying to determine the gender. Sometimes, which is like an abomination to think about, like sometimes doctors will like schedule a C-section for the baby to get born earlier so that they can go on vacation or whatever. Like pregnancy is not really treated as a sacred moment. And all of that makes an imprint on our being. And so these fantasies that happen in the womb begin to shape our awareness. And this is like really primitive. That's why when we did the initial meditations, I was trying to guide you into a somatic experience rather than the thinking mind, because the thinking mind can be quite logical. But all of these things are ingrained really, really deeply into our nervous system. The personal subconscious is another layer that structures. It's a little bit more conscious. This one can be quite funny, I like to think, because it's more easy to deal with. And the personal subconscious is completely personal for each of us. You know, it's like, even if you grew up with siblings and your mother or your father or your caregiver made sure that all of you had the same portion of rice and the same amount of cookies and the same brand of clothing, the same, like, even if things were measured, the personal subconscious is going to be different for you and your brother or your sister, you know, if you have siblings. If not, then it's going to shape you as uniquely. But it's funny because the last a couple of workshops ago, I did this with my brother, and it was like really funny to see like how completely different the personal subconscious are, even if we grow up in the same household. And so one of the things that I really like for us to think about is interference patterns. So it goes like this, like, has anybody heard about projection and identification? Okay, so this is basic psychoanalytic understanding. It's really simple. A projection is an energetic, projection is an energetic pierce, an energetic transference, an energetic desire that will come to you from someone else. A projection is something that somebody else thinks about you and sends your way. And an identification is when you accept that projection. So somebody may project onto me that I am spiritual, and I can identify with that. That's really simple. Somebody may project to me that X, Y, or Z. It doesn't matter. You'll explore your own. But a projection is what comes to you, and an identification is when you say, okay, I identify with this, and it matches, you know? And there can be negative projections or positive projections, but either way, they're something that determines who we are, but it's not necessarily true. So this goes in layers. Like it begins with our nuclear family system. The interference pattern, this is a concept of quantum physics, but it can be very easily applied to our lives. Like if you look at me on the screen, you'll see like we have a father figure or a paternal figure. It can be our dad, or it can be a grandfather or an uncle or a stepdad. It doesn't matter. There's a masculine figure in our lives, and there's a feminine figure in our lives, usually our mother, but it can be some sort of other mother figure. And each of them have our own idea or projection of who we're going to be as their child. And so we will receive one projection from this paternal figure, and we will receive one projection from our mother figure. They're usually not the same, obviously. And so they're coming towards us, and when they meet, they create like this interference pattern. And you're like, okay, who do you want me to be? And we receive that projection. What's fascinating to me about this is that we always have a choice. This is what I was explaining before. We always have a choice to say, okay, mommy, I accept your projection. I'm going to identify with this and be this the rest of my life. Don't worry, I'll make this out for you. Or we can say, fuck you, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to go my own way. But either way, it's linked to the same projection. So it's never free will. Does that make sense? Like it's always linked to that one projection. So for instance, if the mother comes to the child and says, I relate more to feminine figures because that's my own, but I'll use some masculine figures as well. Like, you're going to be a beautiful ballerina dancer, you know? And you can say like, okay, mommy, I'm going to do that. Or you can say like, no way, like I'm going to be this punk girl. It's still linked to the same projection. Do you see? Like, it's not like you say, no, I'm just going to go on my quest and discover who I truly am. Like we usually just reject and rebel against the projection that is given. Does that make sense? It's either a compliance or like we rebel. It's only later in adulthood that we actually begin to discover who we are. And this tears up with our extended family system, like the projections that our aunts, uncles, the projections that our neighbors have on us, the projections that everybody around us has on who we are. Like, wow, he's so intelligent. Wow, he's such a businessman. Oh, wow, he's going to be just like his father, or like whatever the projections are. We begin to know like, oh, okay, I can follow this. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to be this, you know, and we begin to build this identity on projections. It happens in the kindergarten and then later in school, in the social system. When we are growing up with friends, I always like to use this example, like if in like school you were called sort of like a slut, or we called like zorra in Costa Rica. Like it's crazy how that just imprints on our being. And then we have to repeat that somehow because we identified with it. And it's really hard to like distill away from it. And whatever the projections are later in life. So this one can become quite fun to explore, can be painful as well, but it's when we realize that, you know, this projection that I received from this moment in life has shaped my identity, but is it even real? You know, like it's who I believed myself to be, but what, like, is this true? And then the collective subconscious is based on culture, class, and epoch. So it's very different to grow in a collective subconscious in Costa Rica than in Ukraine, in Costa Rica than in one of the Eastern European countries. But we all have a collective subconscious. And the collective subconscious is ruled by usually the media nowadays, but on the ideals, and the master signifiers that the culture has alive at that moment. So a master signifier is what it says is it's a master signifier. It's like what everybody should be thinking about. So 25 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, the master signifier was money. Like everybody has to be somehow making a lot of money. And if you're not making a lot of money, you're not successful. And we can glaze this in however ways we want, but this is like, that was the master signifier. Like our parents could have told us like, you can do whatever you want, you can be happy as long as like you're making money, right? Like that's always the master signifier. Now there's a shift that is happening. It's quite a strong one, but in the collective subconscious is all the fantasies that we have stored in our being from the collective that dictate who we should be as members of society, as members of a group, as citizens, as workers, as human beings. And you can guess right now like what the current collective value is. Like there's a lot of fear. The media is like raging over fear, loss, destruction, and all of this is having an imprint on our collective subconscious. Like sometimes we may wake up feeling quite overwhelmed, and it has nothing to do with us individually, but it's like the energetics of the collective, right? And because we're a part of that and we're intrinsically connected to that, we feel it. I'm gonna leave this here for a while. Then we have the archetypal subconscious. The archetypal subconscious is deeper into our being because it's not collective necessarily, although Jung did write the Red Book and he talks a lot about the collective subconscious as the archetypal one, but I see them as separate, at least for our day and age, because the archetypal subconscious is that more primitive quality of being alive in this world. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with either Jung's or Joseph Campbell's work. I'll try to introduce you to it as we go. It's really beautiful because they were able to bring into light how all of these amazing stories of mythology, of history, of culture, of primordial patterns, let's say, sprout from consciousness and we embody them. And so when we talk about archetypes, it can be quite funny. Like, you should see what happens in like one-on-one sessions, like people talking about their archetypal patterns. It's like, I was Cleopatra in my past life, or things like this. Like, okay, let's go a little bit deeper. Like archetypes want to incarnate through us and reveal like our path in this lifetime. And as we're talking about who we truly are, I really love to think about the self as a container or a channel for these energies to express themselves. And there's some societal distortions that happen due to capitalism. And this is where the archetypal and the collective subconscious come together, because somebody may be born into this world as with the archetype of a healer, for example. And bear with me with this example, because this can get a little bit tricky. Somebody can be born with the calling to become a healer. And the logical step, because of societal conditions, is to go to medical school. And so you go to medical school, you study medicine. And what you learn basically is that you should be giving medication, because that is where most of the money is, because that's the pharmaceutical industry. And so although you were born with the archetype of becoming a healer, the collective subconscious is so distorted that we will forget what does that actually mean to us? How does that represent in our heart? What was the longing in our heart? What was the deepest yearning that we had? And so we let somehow, I mean, it's not our fault, it's society's fault, it's Kali Yuga's fault, or the age that we are in, where everything's distorted. We miss it, you know? We miss the chance. It doesn't mean that it cannot be course corrected. And that's why this information, I think it's valuable, because it can really help people realign and restructure. It doesn't matter where in our lives we are. And so I want to read to you this poem by Joseph Campbell. This is in the beginning of his book, The Hero's Journey. And you can read it along with me if you want. We have not even to risk the adventure alone, for the heroes of all time have gone before us. The labyrinth is thoroughly known. We have only to follow the thread of the hero path. And where we had thought to find an abomination, we shall find a god. And where we had thought to slay another, we shall slay ourselves. Where we had thought to travel outwards, we shall come to the center of our own existence. And where we had thought to be alone, we shall be with all the world. So when we're working with archetypal patterns or the archetypal subconscious, it really is uprooting yourself and rising. It's like going deep into the root and uprising those deeper yearnings or those deeper callings that we have. And there's some pointers here to ask you how to go deeper and explore that. First, it's usually where our fear is. So again, meeting life with an open heart and facing fear and choosing to go beyond that fear. And there's this need to trust in the inherent intelligence of the way life is unfolding at its own time. But we also have to develop our courage to expand beyond the comfort zones that we have. A really beautiful way for me to look at archetypal patterns is, where can I serve? You know, what gifts do I have that can become of service to the world? Because the archetypal pattern, and when you look at the hero's journey and Joseph Campbell work, it's always about getting lost. So you begin and you get lost. You find yourself and you find your gift. But it doesn't end there. You have to bring those gifts back to where you came from, or take them somewhere else. But the idea is sharing those gifts, sharing that wisdom that you gained, and it's unique to you. And the question always is, what are you fighting right now? What are you resisting right now? Another quote by Joseph Campbell: "We must be willing to let go of the life we planned so as to have the life that is waiting for us." I mean, this gives me chills. I don't know about you. And that's the call to adventure. The call to adventure is the restructuring of our personal and collective values to really listen to our hearts. And it's a return to the art of living. And each one of us will have our own way of doing that. It's like, okay, how do we truly think? What is true philosophy? Or what is true healing? What is true music? You know, what is real architecture? Like, if you look at like the architecture of like the ancient world, and you see like the beautiful mosques or like Greece, it's so fascinating. Like, everything was in service. Everything was made out of devotion, if not for like a so-called God, for society. And now like architecture is so reserved for like master signifiers, the ones who have money, right? And so it's like this huge segregation of values, when it would be so much better like if all of us could really put our talents and services out there, right? And the same is for law. Like, how distorted, like, oh my God, like look at politics right now, like how distorted. Shouldn't it be quite like simple? But it's the greed that drives us human beings to segregate and control and manipulate and try to have everything so that we and the ones that we like are okay, you know? But that creates contraction, and then that creates sickness, and then that creates a lot of karma. So the call to adventure is this call to listen to our roles, to listen attentively to what are the deepest yearnings, the deepest callings within our heart. And here are a few resources you can access to dive deeper if you resonate with this subject of the archetypal patterns. I scheduled this to go until 12:15, but we may need like 7 more minutes. So if that's okay with everyone, we can finish the presentation. Is everybody okay with that? Otherwise, if you have to go, I'll upload the recording and you can finish when you have a chance, but we only have about 10 more minutes to go. So the guiding principle of this is follow your bliss. If you're familiar with mantras, there's this mantra in Sanskrit that's Sat, Chit, Ananda, not shit, chit. Chit means intelligence. Intelligence is the intelligence of being, Sat, Chit, Ananda. And Ananda is bliss. It's not happiness, right? It's this joy that is not linked to any conditions. And so what Joseph Campbell, when he went to India and he discovered this mantra, maybe he knew it before, but he inquired on this mantra. I don't know if he knew it before. When he inquired on this mantra, he recognized that, okay, sat shit, like, how do I know God as self? It's really difficult, is what we were trying to say earlier, like, how do you define truth? You have to go through what is not true in order to get to what is true. That's the via negativa, that's the neti-neti. Intelligence, like, how can my human little brain comprehend God as absolute intelligence? That's really difficult. But ananda, bliss, that's quite, easy if we're in touch with our inner being. Like, we know what brings us love. We know what causes us happiness. Happiness, I know it's tricky, like what causes us joy. And so if we didn't have to think about money, or time for that matter, how would we like to live our lives? How would we like to love? How would we love? How would we do what we like to do? And Ramana used to say to all of the Europeans that would go and visit to him, Ramana, as there was a time he became quite popular. So it's this like Indian guru who all he did was like walk around the mountain and meditate. And a lot of Westerners, especially people from England, David Godman included, like if you haven't seen his work, it's fascinating. It's David Goodman, I'll link it. But Ramana used to tell people when people would come and visit him and ask him questions, and really complex questions about life, he would tell them, go back the way you came from. And that's quite disrespectful, I think. But what he actually meant is like, you already have the answer. You just have to go back and find it. Like, there's nothing I can give you that you can't find, right? If you do follow your bliss, you put yourself on a kind of track that has been there all the while, waiting for you. And the life that you ought to be living is the one you are living. So it's not somewhere else. It's not, oh, when I do this, then I'll be able to achieve my bliss. It's right now. Follow your bliss and don't be afraid. And doors will open where you didn't know they were going to be. And this is the way that I think that we can restructure society. Because society nowadays, as I explained with the example of the doctor or architecture, like it doesn't support this. But this is the way that we are doing it. Like how we relate to each other with our own gifts and talents and professions. That's what's going to create a change. From the grassroots, obviously, it's not going to be so massive, but it makes a difference. The sixth layer is sanskaras, and sanskaras are those tendencies that we have very deeply ingrained in our being that come from the past. And the past can be years ago, or the past can be lifetimes ago. We don't know, but sanskaras is what we call or what in Hindu philosophy is this like really deeply ingrained thing that we can't get like we can't get done with. And so sanskaras are really interesting. I love to think about sublimation. Sublimation is a word that Freud used a lot when we're talking about our desires. And to bring it full circle, this is what I was talking about in the beginning when I introduced freedom. And does freedom mean that then I go and sleep with everybody? Is that the way that I'm going to find freedom if I have sexual desire, to use one example? Or can I sublimate that? And sublimation is, the path of sublimation is so beautiful because it means that we take on those yearnings and those desires and we try to bring them to the highest level we have available. So it's not like we're going like, oh, I have sexual desire, I'm gonna go and act that out. That's fine if you wanna do that. But there's another path where you can bring that to the highest level possible. And that will be very different for each individual. And so it's really different to spiritual bypass it and say, oh no, I'm done with this. I'm not even going to think about it, to like integrate it. Okay, this is really happening in my awareness. How do I sublimate it? And the seventh structuring layer is the Atman, our real self, that is always present. It is all pervading. It's the underlying love. That's when we refer to the spiritual dimension, right? It's like the ground of being is always there. It never changes. It influences, but it's there. It's the ground of being. And so Swadhyaya is, are you familiar with this concept? Swadhyaya is a yogic vow that means self-discovery. And so what we're doing in this workshop is taking this vow very seriously. I'm just kidding, you can do whatever you want with it. But the idea of Swadhyaya is that we commit to our hearts to explore what is really going on with all these layers. And the more that we can take a look at these layers, the more clarity and creativity and potential we have access to. The more we feel stuck in our lives, the more is a greater opportunity to take attention inward and see, you know, if these structures resonate. Okay, is there something here about a personal subconscious that I'm dealing with? Is there some sort of interference pattern between the projections? Or if it's something more energetic, it can be linked to the way that we were raised, the way that we were in the womb, so on and so forth. But Swadhyaya is a work of purification, and that's the distilling, that's the taking off, peeling the layers, and learning to sublimate those desires. And I love this quote. It's by Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. It's a Tibetan Buddhist teacher. He says, when we engaged in the practice of discovering space, we should develop the feeling of opening ourselves completely to the entire universe. We should open ourselves with absolute simplicity and nakedness of mind. This is the powerful and ordinary practice of dropping the mask of self-protection. So all of that may seem very overwhelming and a lot to digest. But the good thing is that it's always been happening. It's not like these are new structures that we're trying to grapple with. We're always trying to grapple with this in our inner world. And the workshop, what it's doing is trying to make it somehow approachable and comprehensive. I have a graph that I want to show you. And I didn't show it to you before because I wanted you to make out of this information however your mind was going to shape it when we talk about the layers. This is the way that I have found that it's useful for me to comprehend it, but I wanted you to digest it on your own so that you, like, how do you process it? So this is the way that I like to structure it so that it's a little bit easier to navigate. I can send you a picture later, but we'll go over it. So the me is those identities that we think that we are, like, oh, I'm Prema, meditation teacher, I'm always happy, blah, blah, blah. The sensor is that entity that decides what comes in and what doesn't. And then we have these layers, layer by layer by layer, that define who we are. And the conscious mind doesn't have so much power as the unconscious mind. I made it a little bit larger than it actually is. But the idea is the unconscious mind is much larger. And so it has much more strength. So even though here I can be like, yay! I can be like, no, or whatever I'm feeling. This is much stronger than what I think I am. And so it's like an iceberg, right? Like, this is what you see. That actually looks like a penis, sorry. That's my, okay. So that's an iceberg. Talk about subconscious. And so in an iceberg, you see only the tip of it, right? But what has much more power? Right? It's the same with our minds. So I'm going to take off this very inappropriate drawing. I'll send you a picture without it. But that's the way that I see it. And actually what I've been thinking about this graph is that the whole whiteboard is the self, right? So even though we may see the Atman as just a layer, it's the whole self, right? And so we were talking about codes, all of this information being stored there as a code. And so I want to give you a few tools for you to work with. But before, why is this important? Prema, why are you going over this? This is so overwhelming. Okay, all scriptures say that the ego is the root of all suffering. And that's the reason why we suffer. And all of this is our egoic structure. And so this work of unveiling is what brings us access to more love, more truth, more goodness, more wisdom. Okay, so dream interpretation. This is a wonderful tool of self-discovery. And self-discovery is really important to think about that word. Like, it's not like, oh, I know myself now. Discovery, it's a process of discovery. It never ends. And we're constantly going over what is happening at this moment within my being. Dreams are codes. They're not always explicit. Sometimes they can be, but they're always bringing information about what is going on in our subconscious. Some dreams can be teleological. That means that they may address something that may happen in the future. And I'm sure that you have had occasions where you dream that something's about to happen and then it happens and it's like, wow, it's natural. It's the Atman sending a message to the conscious mind. And it cannot send the message very clearly. Like it cannot say like, hey, listen, you're gonna get really angry about this and I want you to deal with it in the best way that you can. Like that's not possible. It needs to come up as a symbol so that we can, as a code, so that we can interpret it. Why? Because, let me take this off first. Because if we have a dream coming or a symbol coming from, let's say, the archetypal subconscious that wants to reveal itself and it wants to be made conscious to the conscious mind, it's going to pass through the sensor. And the sensor is going to distort it. And so by the time that it arrives to the conscious mind is already kind of like messed up. So it's really important to pay attention to the patterns in our dreams. And if you don't have it already, I recommend you to have like a dream journal, and you can like journal the dreams that come up, the feelings that come up with it. You don't have to have an interpretation at this moment. Please don't go into Google and write like, what is the meaning of a red car in a dream? Because that's going to give you something that's not yours. Dream interpretation is completely unique for you. And it's useful to have a guide to go over this with. If you have a therapist or if you go to a psychoanalyst, or you want to take the 6-month journey with me, not that I'm a pro in dreams, but having some aid and guide that can help you unravel the messages in your dreams. Another tool that we have is meditation, because meditation is that overcoming of the censor. As I was saying earlier, it can be overwhelming to sit in silence and recognize everything that is going on. And so we rather not go there, especially the more that we practice, because in the beginning, meditation can be like, but the more that we practice, we realize all that's going on. And I really resonate with this quote from it's Thich Nhat Hanh, and he says, no mud, no lotus. The metaphor of the lotus is really beautiful. Like the lotus grows, it's this beautiful, pristine flower that grows from the thickest, most ugliest mud ever up into and blooms untouched by all of those conditions. And that's what we're doing in meditation. We're drilling deep into. Our karmic events are also tools to work with, because karmic events are those events that make us pause deliberately and make a decision. are those events that help us pause, reflect, and choose, okay, how do I really want to live my life right now? It can be from like our computer being broken to like a car accident to breaking something, anything that we associate to like, oh wow, that was intense. Like, let me hone down energy for a second and see what's really going on and choose how we want to deal with consciousness, with the way that we're approaching life. And all of these tools, is important that if there's one thing that you're going to take on from this workshop is like try to observe without judgment, because many times we may approach self-sabotage, or we may approach the things that feel contracted with a lot of judgment, like, I should be expanding at this moment. But really, to learning to observe without judgment what arises and what disappears is key. So another way that we can see what's going on in our subconscious is looking at slips. I just had a slip, like the one with the iceberg that I said it looked like a penis, like that's a slip. Like it's when we intend to do something and it transforms into something else, and that's saying something about our subconscious. And like it takes a lot of effort to like not attack yourself or not to shame yourself for doing something like that. Like, did you see what I had, the way that I dealt with it? It was like a live example of like, okay, how do we deal when an unconscious thing comes up? It's okay. Like just see it, note it, and then deal with it, right? Slips is usually when we talk and we say something that we didn't mean to say. Like we may be talking with a friend and we mean to say one word and we end up saying something else. I don't know if that has happened to you. That's something to pay attention to. Also, when we hear something that is not what the other person said, that's something to look into. And this is not always like negative. Again, there's nothing wrong or good about this. Like, I will never, ever forget. It's so dearly in my heart. In one of my first sessions with a client, we did a 6-month journey together, and she began to call all fruits and vegetables carrots, which in Spanish is zanahoria. And like she couldn't call things like apple, like everything was a zanahoria. Like it was one day, right? And everything was like zanahoria, zanahoria, zanahoria. And exploring that slip, if you take it apart, is like sana ahora. And it's these beautiful messages that life is constantly giving us if we learn to listen to our hearts. We learn to listen to our symptoms without judgment, like, why am I developing this? What do I need to look inside? Without blame. When we're rewilding our connection to our intuition, because when we were really little, before we developed the sensor, we were quite awake and knowledgeable of like, whoa, this doesn't feel good, right? That's our somatic experience. That's what we're trying to develop. So I want to leave you with this invitation that suffering is a call to investigate what is truly going on with an open heart. And I have some questions that I would love for you to explore on the intermission before we meet again at 4:30. These are questions that are linked to the information that we just reviewed. I'm going to send you the slides so that you have all this information and then you can work with the questions. And again, you don't have to send me your answers, like it's not homework, right? It's an invitation for exploration. And I do encourage you to take the time to explore because that's where the juice is. But for now, I'm sorry I went over time, but I'm really grateful for your attention and for being here. And if any questions come up during the intermission, feel free to write me or also bring them to the, we will review them at 4:30. We will also see a little bit, it's not very complex as this, we will just look at how Buddhism can help us deal with this, okay? All right, have a beautiful afternoon. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Prema.
Thank you so much, Prema.
You're so welcome.